Well, Dr. Barrow, I wonder if you wouldn't mind, we had talked last time about some of the work that you did in terms of saving historic buildings at the University of Florida. And not many people are aware of this story. You know, we come onto campus now, especially the northeastern part of the campus. We have these beautiful historic buildings. They have plaques. They give us a sense of history and gravitas. But we almost lost those buildings, right?
Absolutely. Well, the story is Sam Proctor, university historian, Roy Hunt, university law professor and preservation, internationally known, and Blair Reeves, internationally known preservation professor. So they also happen to be patients of mine. So when they would come in, we'd talk about history and stuff. And they also helped me and others establish the Matheson Museum back in we opened in 1993. So they were very, very involved with that. Well, Roy called me one day. I was in private practice and on East University Avenue in a building my wife had restored. And said they were having a problem, that their university senate was looking at the historic houses on campus. And they had appointed a committee of he and Blair and Sam, and also a couple of other people, I don't remember the name, and asked would I be on that committee. And he said, because you're not on the faculty, you're not on the staff, you can perhaps say things that some of us couldn't say. I said, well, I'll be glad to be your bastard son on that committee and do it. So we tried our best to get in to see Dr. Morrison. Let me get this thing off. Excuse me. Dr. Morrison, Robert Morrison, I guess. Is it Morrison? The one that was president before. I'm trying to. Yeah, who was the president back then? It was Robert Q. Morrison from Mississippi, and then the president from the Jacksonville, the law professor. What was his name?
Robert Morris, you're talking about, then Lombardi, before Lombardi?
Before Lombardi.
Okay, let me check here for you. Let me see, University of Florida presidents. I should know this. I'm kind of having a...
Well, I should too. I'm just blocking on it momentarily.
Robert Bryan was right before... Okay, so let me look at the chronology, Dr. Barrow. So Robert Marston was president from 74 to 84.
Right.
E.T. York was president from 73 to 74. O'Connell, of course, was president from 67 to 73.
Who was after 74?
Right after 74, from 74 to 84, that was Robert Marston.
Who after 84?
And then after 84 is Marshall Chrysler, 84.
That's who okay, well, anyway, we as that committee representing this university senate went to see Robert Marston. And he said, well, I don't get involved in those kinds of politics, about saving buildings and so forth. That's really up to the U.S., to the faculty senate. So we got nowhere there. And then we kept waiting. And now I guess it was about 1990, maybe somewhere in that range. We got an appointment in to see Marshall Chrysler. Well, the Charlie Pell scandal was going on at the time. It was hard for us to get in. It took a couple of months, but we finally got in there, and the three of us, plus another person or two and myself, went to see him, Marshall Chrysler. I had photographs made of all the original buildings up till 1925 made on postcards, and had those framed in 2 frames to give to Marshall Kreiser. And we went in, and I had never met him. He was very taciturn, sat behind his desk, and all he said was, "Well, what can I do for you fellas?" And so Sam started off explaining the situation, that there were buildings on the National Register that were in jeopardy. And I had called the university planner and gone over there to see him and about 2 weeks before, and had asked him, were there buildings on the demolition list? And he said, absolutely. I was hired to increase classroom capacity, and the Floyd Hall and Science Hall and Language Hall are due to be demolished next year. And so I reported that back to Roy and Sam and Blair, and of course we were very upset. So Sam gave a very, very passionate, plea that we should save our historic buildings. If we need more space built around them, or build in other locations. And Blair did the same. Roy did the same. He gave some of the history of it and so forth. And I more or less did the same and presented my pictures. Well, this took about a half hour. He didn't say a word. He just sat behind his desk and listened. And when we got through, he said, I think it was Al also Brooks was his assistant, I think. And he said, Al, are those buildings really on the demolition list? He said, I don't know, sir. He said, well, go call Gary Kopke was the guy's name. I'll never forget it, and see if that's true. So he went out and called and came back in a couple of minutes and said, yes, sir, they're on the demolition list for next year. And he said, go back and call him and tell him that I said, take them off the demolition list immediately. And, we all looked sort of surprised. And he says, we shouldn't be destroying our original buildings on the campus. That's terrible. And besides that, I can raise money to restore those buildings. And I'll call Ben Hill Griffin today. He went to Floyd Hall. It was College of Agriculture where it was. And called, and I think I can raise some money to restore that one quickly. So we thanked him very much, and we were patting ourselves on the back. And later on, he called, I think, Roy or Sam, and said, I just talked to Ben Hill Griffin. And I said, Ben Hill, Floyd Hall is in danger of being demolished. We want to restore it. Can you help us? And he said, Marshall, you tell people there, if they tear down Floyd Hall, I will never give another cent, and I'll take all my money and go to Georgia. And so he gave him $5 million on the spot, and he matched it, and they restored Floyd Hall. Later on, the Keene, Mistress Keene came in, and we're talking to some of the people, and I'm again blocking on the names. They turned this over to two gentlemen in the College of Arts and Sciences to run these projects, and they did a marvelous job. But anyway, they showed him Keene, showed the Keenes Science Hall, and they said they wanted to give $1 million, but they wanted to decide what to give it for. And they looked at this and they said, oh, this is beautiful, a wonderful project. He said, well, we really need $4 million. And they looked at each other sort of funny, and she said, honey, we've got the money. Let's just go ahead and do it. And they were very intimately involved with that restoration. And somebody else did Language Hall. So that's the story on that. Now they, Murray Laurie and others helped identify all those buildings, and they have a historic, it's all their historic district. It's on the National Register. I don't know how many other universities in the country have a National Register on their campus, but that's one of the few. And then Mary Laura did history of all the buildings, and she's a historic preservationist here in town. She lives at the village where I live, the village at Santa Fe Community College, and so forth. But anyway, then they got plaques, and it's a big deal now, the historic campus. So that's the way they were sell. There were two buildings lost. There was a little building beside the auditorium and tower. It was just a shed type building that was torn down, and then the commons burned. Actually, after I left the university. And then Walker Hall, which was the engineering hall of Amazing, began to split apart 3 or 4 inches at the top. It was, and they felt it was not safe, and it was torn down, another building built. But otherwise, all the other buildings are there. The first, all the original buildings, and so it's a wonderful thing.
It is. It's a remarkable story, Dr. Barrow. Well, I wonder now, could you talk a little bit more about your relationship with people like Roy Hunt and Sam Proctor, and give us a sense of behind the scenes, like how your team, and I think there was a name, I saw a newspaper clipping at one point for the 4 of you, and they were called you what was, there was a kind of a nickname that you all had.
Little old lady with tennis shoes.
Something, yeah, right.
Little old ladies with tennis shoes. And who was the acting president before Marshall? You mentioned his name a minute ago.
Let's see, before Marshall. Now, E.T. York was interim president from 73 to 74.
Before E.T. York.
Before E.T. York was Stephen O'Connell. And then before.
Somewhere there was somebody that was an interim president there between presidents.
Okay. So between O'Connell and Marston, you had E.T. York was interim president from 73 to 74. That's the one I see in the UF site. Now they could be missing someone, because then Marshall Kreiser takes over in 84.
How about who was after him?
Then after Marshall Kreiser, you're okay. So we're going, yeah. After Marshall Kreiser, the interim president is Robert Ryan.
Yes. Robert Ryan was working in the administration building, and when we woke up, he and Sam were always joking with him and teasing each other constantly. And he had accused Sam of having 5 different offices, which was true. he had them all over campus. And Sam said, "Well, I have to keep my stuff on all these offices." But anyway, as we walked up, he says, "Well, here comes the little old ladies in tennis shoes." He says, "You aren't going to win on this one. They're going to tear those buildings down." But we got the last laugh on that. But that was the term.
How long did you know Sam Proctor before this, Dr. Barrow? Can you talk a bit about your relationship with Sam?
I met Sam when I went into private practice in 1987. I knew him and of him when I was a student at the University of Florida. I was there from 53 to 56, got my BS degree, and then went on to the medical school, graduated in 1960, and did residency there. But he became a patient of mine, as did Roy Hunt and as did Blair Reeves, because we were preservation interested together. My wife was restoring houses all over town. My wife Mary restored 21 houses in Gainesville, Florida. Nobody knows about that, and led the preservation movement big time back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. But anyway, when the American Legion building became available on East University Avenue, we purchased that to create a local museum. And I asked Roy and Blair and Sam to be on the early board, plus 12 other people, including Sarah Matheson and others I won't mention right now. But anyway, they were very, very interested in that and very, very helpful in that. Sam was especially helpful. He actually gave us a whole group of the Florida Historical Society publications, except for the volume 1 through 6. We have them all, and they're from Sam. And then I subscribed in the 80s and got them from then on. We have a nearly complete set. They have a complete set at the university. Sam also gave us all the Jewish accumulations and material that he had that was put in his will to go to the Mathesons. And we were very, very, very close. And he had always had good advice. And he always, I used to go to his house at least once a month, and I would have lunch with he and Bessie, who was a wonderful cook, for lunch. So we were very, very, very close. And he had all of these wonderful story. And Sam was very good at his interviews. He could get stuff out of people that no one else could get out. And he interviewed me back, I don't remember the date, 90s, I suppose. And I said things in there that if I'd known it was going to go on go online, I probably wouldn't have said, and so forth. But in any case, he did extensive interviews on everybody. I don't know if anybody interviewed him. Do you know?
Yes.
I'm sure they did.
You know, his last graduate assistant before Sam retired, and blanking his name now, but he's the head librarian out at Western Washington University now. First name is Mark Greenberg, I believe. But he did some interviews with Sam in the early 2000s.
Yeah. Sam loved the Heritage Club that was in the Siegel building. He was on the staff on that, and he got up a bunch of pictures of early history, probably 20 or so that they had in their hallway of early history of Gainesville University that he provided for them. And he would about once a month take Mary and I there for dinner. There's a high-end place and so forth. So we were very close. Also extremely close, and still am, with Roy Hunt. He's now at the Oak Hamilton, but Roy was the historic preservation professor that established the historic districts for Gainesville, but also for San Antonio and a bunch of other towns. He was the most knowledgeable historic preservation law professor in the country, and still is, most likely. And then Blair was internationally known as a preservation professor, and he established the Caribbean conference and the one up at the walking on it now, where the island off of North Carolina, where they went and did measured drawings of all those historic houses, and they actually gave him a building to house the preservation students every summer. And we went up there one summer, and with Blair. So we were very close to Blair and Marinell also. Marinell has been, Blair passed away 3 years ago, Sam 4 or 5 years ago, but Roy is still alive.
Roy, Roy is doing a lot of curriculum work with the Institute for Learning and Retirement, and he's recruited me to give a few talks over the summer with the ILR folks. But a wonderful person, and he was able to get the Proctor program some funding to do oral histories in St. Augustine several years ago. Yeah,
he's been very involved with St. Augustine. He was very influential in helping save the Bridge of Lions, which they in their wisdom were going to tear it down and build a new bridge. And he got involved with that and said to the people, well, the first thing we need to do is get it as a national landmark, then they can't tear it down. They were going to use some federal funds. And so that happened. And then city officials sort of had a change of heart. We need to keep this historic bridge there. And they were going to tear it down and build a bigger bridge further down the line or something. I don't know what they were going to do. But anyway, Roy has been very helpful in that. He's still very active in worthwhile causes. Of course, he's traveled everywhere in the world. He's a world traveler also, including Antarctica. And so anyway.
Dr. Barrow, you mentioned earlier this phrase, tear it down. And as you know, in Gainesville, a lot of buildings over the years, over the decades, have been torn down. And, you know, there's always this tension between progress and history, it seems. But you mentioned that your wife, Mrs. Mary Barrow, had done some really amazing work in restoring houses in Gainesville. Can you talk about that and the work that she has done?
Yes, well, early on, there were some houses torn down. the main building that was torn down was the courthouse, the old red brick courthouse, which is a perfectly fine building. And in 1978, 79, somewhere in there, the county commission voted to tear it down and build a new courthouse. And what they did was they built a new courthouse around the building, and then they demolished it. There was no historic preservation movement or organization in town, but several lawyers did in fact sue the county commission not to tear it down. And the judge said, you know, I'm very sympathetic. I don't think it should be torn down personally, but the county commission has the right to vote to tear it down if they so wish. So it was torn down in 1978, 79. I was in medical school and graduated in 60, and then was in residency in 1968, 69. I did a residency, a fellowship, worked on a PhD 2 years, went to NIH for 2 years, then came back on faculty in 1968, and then decided to go into private practice in Gainesville in 1969, because at that time, believe it or not, they only paid assistant professors $17,000, $18,000 a year, and we had 5 kids and bought a little house, and we just weren't making it. So I joined the Gainesville Medical Group, and we started off by buying the Taggart home on Northeast 10th Avenue. And at the same time, a law professor and English professor and his wife, realtor Jane Myers, they bought a house in the district and all started restoring their houses. And this would have been in the early 1970s. We had a terrible time getting the loan to restore the Taggart house. The story, if you want to hear it on the Taggart house, is that Mary and I were looking for an old house to restore, couldn't find anything. And Dr. Lamar Roberts, who was a neurosurgeon at Shands, the head of the department, his wife was a realtor, Louise Roberts. And she called Mary and said, Mary, I think the Taggart house may be coming up for sale. I hear a rumor. You might go by and talk to the people. So Mary and I went over there one Sunday afternoon in 1969 and knocked on the door, and this elderly couple came. He was a university historian professor and military professor. I forget his name, their names. She was quite wealthy, and there was silver and everywhere all over the house and real high-end paintings and so forth. But they had neglected it for 10 years, hadn't painted, done anything. Floor was all marbled and everything. So we said, well, we introduced ourselves and said, we heard you might be interested in selling your house. And they said, well, yes, we are. We're going to move into a smaller place. We've already got the place, but we hadn't listed it or anything, and we hadn't even talked about it. And I said, well, we'd be really, really interested in the house and restoring it. And she said, well, honey, let's go back in the kitchen and talk about it. And so we could hear everything they were saying. We were sitting in the living room, and there's a nice young couple, and la-di-da-di-da, and so forth. So they came back in after a few minutes and said, yeah, we'll sell it. And I said, well, how much? He said, 35. And we had seen these houses in Charleston and Savannah. We'd been studying old houses while we were at NIH and Georgetown and so forth. These are $350,000, $400,000 houses they're talking about. And I said, you mean 350? He said, no, 35,000. So I had a contract in my pocket. I said, well, we'll buy it. Yes, sir. So we signed the contract on the spot. Well, then we went to our bank and they said, hey, we're not loaning houses in that area. Everybody's dying or moving out. It'll be a slum soon, and we're going to be torn down, bulldozed down. There'll be high rises all over the place there. We said, what, are you insane? There are nice old houses in there. And so then we went to every bank in town, got the same story. And then we went to back to Fortune Federal 3 times. And every time they would turn us down. Well, the third time we went there, their greeter, I'm trying to think of his name. He started Fortune Federal. He owned it, and then he retired. But he still went down as a greeter. He was in his 80s. may have been Spicer, but I'm not sure what his name was. But he lived on 10th Avenue. And I knew that. And so we said, we're trying to buy the Tiger. He said, oh, the Tiger House is a wonderful house. I've been there dozens of times. He was a personal friend of mine, a great man, James J. Tiger was. And we said, well, we're running into a problem. Your bank won't loan us the money. He said, what? What are you talking about? How much do you want? We said, well, we only want $30,000. And he says, come with me. So he goes over to the new president, all decked out in tie and white suit and all that. Doesn't knock on the door, just opens the door. Johnny, I want to introduce you to the Barrows. He's a nice kind of couple. He's in practice of medicine here, and they want to buy the Tiger House. They need a loan for $30,000. He said, well, sir, we're not loaning money on the Northeast area or any other banks because we're afraid buildings are going to be torn down and be a slum. And he says, what? That's a nice area. I have a house there. Are you insane? Loan them the money. So he turned and walked out, and he said, well, I guess we will. But that's how we got the money. We had a heck of a time. And then this was in the 1970s. Well, in 1975, we bought a building across from the Matheson Museum, later known as Melting Pot. It was we bought that building. It was originally a church, and it had been used to rent out for events and things. And we bought it, restored it, and had the Barrow family antiques in there. Had wonderful antiques, and we went buying every weekend all over the place. We owned it for 8 years and furnished our house with antiques. And Mary has restored the Tiger House. And we began to look at old Victorian two-story houses in the Northeast Historic District. And they were on sale for cheap, like $50,000, $60,000. We started buying these gradually here and there, and Mary started restoring about one or two a year. She actually got her contractor's license and had a crew of 7 or 8 people, 2 carpenters, 2 painters, and a gopher or assistant, and so on. And it was amazing. And then we turned them into apartments and rented them as Victorian apartments. So in all, she did over 21 over the next 15, 20 years, which was amazing to me. We had a lot of trouble getting financing. You could not go in with an old house. So we purchased the Paget House apartments, had 8 apartments in it. The first apartments in Gainesville, built in 1904. And we went in to get a loan and said, we want to put in $150,000 and restore it completely. And they wouldn't loan us. They wouldn't do like they would do with new construction. My new construction estimated cost us, $200,000, and you get it. They said, "Oh, we don't do that here. We can loan you on signature $15,000 to get it started, and you can refinance it periodically." So we opened up bank accounts in 6 banks, in every bank in Gainesville, and we would borrow on signature until we got into the major part of the restoration, and then refinance it. And we kept doing that, I guess, for 6, 8, 10 years. And a new bank president from Key West, I don't remember his name, it was saw in the paper, new bank president of Florida National Bank. So we hot-footed it over there Monday. He had a white suit, yellow, blue shirt, and white tie, white shoes, all covered up, very handsome, good-looking man. And he'd been the head bank guy at Key West. And so we said, we've got these 4 houses we're working on, and we like to talk to you about financing. He said, well, how are they financed now? We explained the process. He said, that's ridiculous. In Key West, we treat an old house like a new house. You figure out how much you're going to put into it to restore it, and we make the loan. I'll take them all, everything you got, and you get in the future. So he saved our hides, and that's what we did. We still own 3, the Paget House, the Dean House, and the Pound House. And my son, who's an architect here, John Barrow, manages them, and they do very well. They're high class, we've got great renters, it's very quiet, reserved, and they're much in demand. We've never had a problem with vacancies and so forth. But anyway, Mary was very involved with this in the Northeast and Southeast Historic District. Most important house she stored in the Southeast Historic District was called the Hodges House. and it was next door to the Trinity Episcopal Church. There were two houses, the Love House and the Hodges House. Hodges House had been owned by Dr. Harrison Hodges, who practiced in that house and was a noted physician at the turn of the century. And so they came up, they decided they want to put an educational building, brick building there. And of course they said it's termite ridden and roach infested and rat infested, and we'll give the houses away if anybody wants them for $1. So of course that saved them the demolition costs. That was no big deal. So we took the bait and we got a fellow, High Chima Movers out of Jacksonville, who had moved big houses, brick houses on the barges over there on the river and so forth, and came highly recommended. Nicest guy. He came over and he measured them and looked at them. He said, well, the Love House is too wide to move down the street. It's 2 feet too wide. The Hodges House is I've got 8 to 12 inches to spare on each side of the street. We can move it. So we set up to move it during the summer of 1976, I believe. And the deal was I would get it moved and then Mary would restore it. She went away to her, we had a cottage in Fort Walton Beach she went to for the summer, every summer. And so I arranged to have it moved and set on site, and she restored that building. That area was run down totally. There was just junk houses and a lot of drug dealing going on over there. It was a known drug area. And we started on that restoration, but we had to have a place to move the Hodges House. And we looked around, and behind the Swearingen House, which is on the corner of Northeast 7th Street and Northeast 2nd Avenue, called the Swearingen House, built about, all these houses built in the early 1900s. And there was a lot there. And the gentleman that owned the Swearingen House, he and his wife, and he was a noted ornithology professor, wrote the definitive book on birds of the world, elderly, retired, I can block it on his name. But we went over and knocked on the door and said, we'd like to buy your house and the lot behind it. And he said, well, they're for sale. We're going to move to so-and-so out by Mallory Gardens. We got a little house there. This is too big for us. So we negotiated a very fair price. We also bought a bunch of his antiques. He had collected from going all over the world studying birds. And then we moved the Hodges House over there. And it's a Queen Anne Victorian with a turret. And Mary wanted a special blue color for it. And she would go every day. And her head carpenter guy was a fellow named Mike Winnegar. He was not a carpenter. He was a perfectionist. He was world class and could do anything, could build and do anything really well. And she would put colors on that house every morning, look at it morning, evening, and night. And had PPG paint, mix them up. After 24, it was driving me crazy, of course. She finally came home one day and said, well, I got the color. It was a blue-gray. They call it Mary Barrow blue to this day. And it's a subtle blue-gray, very, very beautiful. And that's what she painted the house with. And it was gorgeous inside and out when they got through. They did the floors, they did everything. The carpenter, Mike Winnegar, was so good that in the turret, it had 2 round windows that were round. I mean, they were whatever. One of them had rotted out. One of them was intact. And I said, how in the world are you going to reproduce those? And so he took the good window, took it apart, and saw how they constructed it. And the way they did bending these things for turrets and things back at the turn of the century was they would cut a notch in the back of the board. And it depended on the angle you wanted it to curve, depended on how close the cuts were. So he just reproduced that window, put it all together, and it fit perfectly. And then he found some outlet that sold curved windows and got the right angle, and it fit perfectly in there. So he was amazing. But then we began to worry, what if we get this thing finished and nobody comes because it's in a bad area? And or I began to worry. And but that didn't happen. It was immediately occupied. And that's how we got into that. But we bought together numerous other houses, and we would go to the bank. Mary would get all dressed up with high heels and a nice dress on and redo her hair, and we'd go to the bank. And this happened several times. And then we'd go in and meet the president of the whatever and the secretary, and he'd say, "Well, now, Mrs. Barrow, you just go over here and sit down, and I'll talk to your husband. We'll set all this up." She says, "Oh, no, you won't. We're partners, and I'm intimately involved in this." Man, she did not like that at all. She wanted to be part of the process. Well, in 1976, now we've opened up the antique shop, and Sam, what's his name? Helped start the historic district over there and save the Thomas Center. It'll come to me in a second. There were two things happening. One, the city was talking about putting a road across the Duck Pond Creek, the Sweetwater branch, from northeast 16th Avenue all the way to southeast 16th Avenue to relieve some of the traffic on University Avenue. Well, this would have ruined that whole area, of course. And so the citizens got together, and historic Gainesville was created mainly as a result of that. And then the Thomas Center was closed, and it was empty for a long time. The guys decided they would sell the property, and they were going to sell it and tear it down and build some apartments there. And Sam Proctor, Sam, who lived in the district, he went to the city and he got a grant for $30,000 to study it, and the early grant, and they determined that building and property was worth a lot more than the asking price. So then they got a big grant to restore the Thomas Center. So the Thomas Center was saved and that way, and then Historic Gainesville got together, and it actually went to a city commission vote and was defeated 3-2 to build that roadway through there, and so forth. So that's how the historic preservation movement got involved. And I was involved in it later, but Mary was involved in it very early. Anyway, when I went into private practice, I wanted something to do to relax at night, so I decided I would collect postcards of Gainesville. I'd seen some very beautiful ones of 1900 vintage, and I started doing this, and I became very aggressive. I started advertising in postcard journals, and people started sending me cards and so forth and so on. And this would have been in the 1970s. I also met with Jess Davis, who was the postmaster at the post office downtown. Originally, of course, the Hippodrome, later the building they built, the federal building. But he was a great guy, and he had for years gone around and interviewed people and taken vignettes of history from the old timers all over Alachua County. And he self-published a book called History of Gainesville. It's and then he's redid it. It's called A History of Alachua County because it had lots of Alachua County stuff. Same book. But he was a wonderful man. He was in his late 80s, and I went over to see him. And I said, "When did you get interested in history?" And he said, 1950s. And he said, "And I need somebody to turn over the wand to. I'm going to give you all my stuff, my scrapbooks and my anecdotes, things all written down, and pictures that I have." And it were some postcards of Gainesville. And I took the one. So in 1980, I started talking to late 80s to Roy and Blair and Sam about we need a local history museum, and they agreed. And in around 1990 or so, Sarah Matheson, who had the Matheson House, who happened to be adjacent to the American Legion buildings, just said she wanted to turn her house over as a museum house. And she had offered it to the Alachua County Historical Society, which met every month and did history presentations. And they said, well, we don't have anybody in the society that can manage that. It's a little too much for us. But we were going to create the Matheson Museum. And so we took the bait, and Roy and Pam and I and others on the board decided it was a great idea. So she donated the Matheson House to the originally, I think it was called Friends of Matheson, and then the Historical Archives of Gainesville and Alachua County, and now it's Matheson History Museum. But she made that part of her will, but she had a what's called a living estate. She could live there as long as she lived, but she donated to us. But she put a reserve on it that said it could never be used for anything except a museum house. And if it ever was attempted to be sold, it would revert back to the Florida Historical Society in Tallahassee. So that protected that. Well, then we found out that the American Legion building was for sale. And so we negotiated with them, and we bought that for $160,000. And I went to the city, and I think David Coffey and others of that vintage were on the commission at the time, and said, is there any way possible you could help us with this? And they said, well, as a matter of fact, we have $80,000 left over in our account for parks. If you would take the building and the Matheson House and your property and put an easement on it, that we would, to protect it, we could be justified in loaning you that as part of the park of Sweetwater Park. So we did that, and they helped us buy half of the building, and we raised money to do the other half and bought the American Legion building. We got in a little bit of a tiff with the Friends of the Library because they wanted a building for their friends, and it was next door, and so I met with them and said, well, how much space do you think you need? And they said, well, we need 10,000 square feet. And I said, well, this building's only, 5,000-6,000. Here's the plans of it. Oh, we thought it was bigger than that. So they bowed out. And Ken and Linda McGurn found them a warehouse over in North Bay where they are, which is perfect for that. So we got the building. We then applied for a major grant of $320,000, the largest grant to the state preservation group that's ever been given. Wonderfully, luckily, Roy Hunt was on the board at that time up there, and he had helped a lot of people and was very well respected, so he'll help push through that grant. Well, we were awarded the grant, and then a month later, we got a letter and said they're not funding this year. Florida's in dire straits. I said, oh, no. So that went along for a while, and then they decided to go ahead and fund it, but they reduced it by 10%. So we got that money to restore the building, and then we raised up money and for other things, and that's how the Matheson got started. I stayed involved with it for 25 years and still involved to a certain degree.
Yes, sir. Dr. Barrow, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, but I wanted to see for this session, if you wouldn't mind recounting a wonderful story that you shared with me the last time we spoke about your relationship with Sam and towards the end of Sam's life, and a story involving former UF President Bernie Machin. Would you mind sharing that story?
Wonderful story. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Well, I had met Dr. Machin. I thought highly of him. And my nephew, Josh Barrow, who was very involved with First Methodist Church youth group, and they wanted to have a fundraiser golf tournament. And so he's a typical Barrow. He went straight to the top, went to the president's office and said, is there any way they could help fund this golf tournament to raise money for the youth group at the church? And the secretary, and I didn't know her name, she took a shining to Josh, and he didn't get any money from him, but she said, would you like to work here as an intern? because he was very positive and progress, very gracious and so forth and so on. He said, yeah. So he started working there 3 days a week, and he'd come over to our house for supper. He was in school, and he'd talk about Bernie this and Bernie that. And I said, well, John, do you call him Bernie? He doesn't. You shouldn't be calling him. You should call him Dr. Machin. He said, oh no, he wants to be called that. So I said, well, I have a plan. I want you to talk to him. Sam Proctor is at his home. He's bedridden. He's on oxygen, and I don't think they've ever met. I'm sure they've never met, but he needs to come over and talk to Sam. And so he went the next day, and Dr. Machin said, absolutely. So we set it up for later, another couple of days that week. And so I went over to the administration building and picked him up, and we went because I knew where Sam's house was, and we went there at 12, and Bessie had fixed this wonderful lunch and chicken salad stuff that she made. It was so great, and apple pie and ice cream, all this stuff. And so they got to talking, and Sam was telling all of these wonderful stories. Well, 1 o'clock came along when we were supposed to come back. Because he said, I got appointments at 1. We'll have to be back at 1. Told us, I'll see you a little after 1. So 1 o'clock came, and they kept talking. And 1:30, and I'm sitting there listening. I'm so sorry I didn't record all this, because he was asking him about this. Dr. Machin was about that and this, that, and the other. And Sam would launch into these wonderful, wonderful stories about it. And 2 o'clock came. And then they started calling him and calling Bessie, and he'd say, "Tell them I'll be there in a minute. They can just wait or get another appointment." And pretty soon 3 o'clock came, and so we were there for 2.5 hours talking to Sam, or he was. I didn't say a word much, and finally got him back at 3 o'clock. He said, "That's the most wonderful experience I've ever had, Mark. Thank you so much for doing that." So we were always very close after that. When I would see him, he would bring that up. And Sam died about 3 months later, actually. After we did that, he did that. But I don't know why I didn't record it. The other great story you have never heard, which I should get on tape, is when we moved into the Tigard House, and after it was restored, it was beautiful, and it's filled with wonderful antiques, and Mary had used Mary Bear Blue inside. Anyway, it was beautiful. But I saw Marshall Kreiser's wife, and I don't remember her first name. We were on a committee together. Very nice ladies. She's still there. They're at Oak Hammock, still alive, I think. And I called her and I said, we need to have a dinner over here for all of the presidents that are still alive. She said, that's a wonderful idea. I'm sure they've never all been together. Says, so we picked a date a month later, and she says, we'll cater, bring everything. You just have the place ready. And Mary had it all laid out, in our finest silver and china, and so forth. And they all came, and Marshall Kreiser was president, and J. Wainwright was there, and Bob Bryan was there, E.T. York was there, and I don't think Marston was there. There were 5 or 6 of them that were there, though. And then I asked, Sam was, of course, he traveled all the time, so he was gone, unfortunately. And I asked Roy Hunt and Blair Reeves to come as my guests. So the 3 of us were there, and we had a great meal, and then everybody chatted and so forth. And we made something called President Madison's whiskey sour recipe. Don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's from Bob Cade. Bob Cade used to have what he called a hepatorenal symposium in his office at 4 o'clock Friday afternoon for the residents. And we would go over and have President Madison's whiskey sour recipe and hot cheese dip. He'd talk about 10 minutes on some, he called it wee-wee subject. And then we would just, socialize and so forth. And he would check if this stuff was so strong, it was half whiskey. It was made, he'd get the lemon juice the night before, and he would mix it with 50% juice and all the peels of the lemons and the whiskey, and let it sit overnight. And then he'd take out the peels that were bitter, and then he would serve that with ice. And you couldn't even taste the whiskey. It was strong. 1 would make you feel nice. 2 would make you definite buzz, and 3 would you were incapacitated. And so he would watch. And if anybody had 2 or 3, he'd make them spend the night in the lab. He wouldn't let them go home and drive. So anyway, we had President Madison's recipe. All right, so I'm serving these things. They're saying, "Oh, this is I tell them about Bob Gates stuff." And President Wright's, active in the Presbyterian Church and a teetotaler. He and his wife didn't allow him to have liquor in his house. And he said to me, "I think I'll have one." Whispered in my ear, so I got him one. And he said, "No," and a little while later, he says, "I think I might have one more." I said, "Be careful now." So anyway, we finished the meal, and Marshall Kreiser got up and said, "Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barrow, for doing this. You and Mary for doing this. Very sweet. We've never been together." He said, "I thought it would be fun if each one of us would just talk about our presidency and what we hoped to accomplish and what we did accomplish." And he went around to one J. Wayne Wrights and Robert Marston, E.T. York, and himself, and they talked. And again, it was one of those things we're supposed to disband, started at 7, supposed to leave and go home at 8. I had to work the next morning. 9 o'clock came, 10 o'clock came, they just kept talking. It was wonderful. And I didn't have any way to record it, and Sam wasn't there. I wish that was on, but that was it. They had the best time. That's the only time they've ever been together.
Wow.
And I've told the people at the current president's office they need to have another dinner there, but I don't know if that'll ever happen again. But that's another very wonderful story. Okay, any other subjects you want to cover?
Sir, well, I think let's go ahead and wrap it up for now, Dr. Barrow, because I've taken up over an hour of your time. But if you wouldn't mind, we'll do like a periodical check-in, like maybe early February. If you have
fine. I'm available most anytime.
Okay.
Cover some of this other stuff. Yeah.
Very cool. And then you have Steve Evans from class gave you the link for the Mississippi Public Program.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you there. I have a call into Mark Proctor. We've invited Mark, of course, with everything happening with Fred Levin's passing. I don't know if Mark will be able to join us, but we'll try to get him there as well. And maybe
it's interesting. It sounds like I've got it down on my calendar. Okay, very good. It's good to talk to you. We'll talk again.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Barrow. Have a wonderful day.
You too.